Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. We'll get started here. Very pleased and happy to welcome Judge Gerald Rosen to talk about his book on the Detroit bankruptcy. It's very wonderful, very accessible, very enjoyable. But first, we've got a couple of announcements. The format tonight is we'll talk for about 45 minutes. I'll be happy to take some questions from the audience here and the audience online. And also next Tuesday, we'll be talking with Dr. Felicia George on her book on gambling in the Motor City, the historical and cultural impact. So let's get started. Judge Gerald Rosen was the Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. Mr. Rosen was nominated by the first President George Bush in 1989 to take the post. Judge Rosen has published numerous articles for professional journals and media on a wide range of issues, including civil procedure, ethics, due process, criminal law, legal law, and legal advertising. He served as an adjunct professor of law at U of M Law School, Wayne State Law School, U of D Law School, and the Thomas Schooley Law School. Judge Rosen now works with JAMS, the largest provider in the world of mediation, arbitration, and other alternative dispute resolution services. So please welcome Judge Gerald Rosen. So it's so very wonderful, very accessible, enjoyable book. So let's go back to 2013. What was Detroit's condition at that time, both in its finances and the quality of life? How bad was it, and why did the city land in bankruptcy?
How many of you have lived in the Detroit area back into the 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even before, right?
50s.
Well, like me, I grew up here in the 50s and 60s, and I remember the halcyon days of Detroit. And yes, sir. You speak up.
Yeah, I'm hearing impaired.
Yeah.
Maybe
Appreciate
can you
it.
go?
Get another mic, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get another mic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take a pause here.
Yeah.
It's a little muffled.
A little muffled.
Yeah, we'll get a new. We'll get
We'll get a
a
mic.
It's a little muddy. The sound is a little muddy, like muddy. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get another mic.
Okay. All right, we'll do that.
Test.
Here we go.
Let this on, yeah. And just turn it on here. Okay, I'm on right now. Great. Yeah, there we go. Can begin.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Better?
Yes, thank you.
So how do I turn it up?
It just goes by, you want to have the mic clipped close to your,
Testing 1, 2. Oh,
yeah, so like
There you go.
near the top of your collar
that did it.
or your sweater. It'll pick you up better that way.
All right, let's try this. How's that?
Better? Yeah, better. Great.
If I can find a way to clip it.
There's usually a little squeezy thing
There
there.
it
But
is.
there.
Oh. All right, anyway, so you folks remember what Detroit was like in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was a vibrant city, almost 2 million in population. By the time of the filing of the Detroit bankruptcy in July of 2013, population was under 700,000. It was the largest population loss for any major city, probably in history, but certainly during that time period.
That's what it was in the 1920s.
Yeah, is that right? Yeah. So I think I'll break down the question to two parts. One is the city's financial condition, and the other is the quality of life. So the financial condition. The city was over $18 billion in debt. The city owed $3.5 billion to the pension funds and had stopped making contributions to the retirees' pension funds. The city owed almost $6 billion for the retirees' healthcare system. And really, those numbers are conservatively stated. The pension debt was really much more than $3.5 billion, but there was some creative accounting being done. So it was really much more. It was probably closer to $6.5 billion or even $7 billion in pension debt. When the bankruptcy petition was filed on July 18th, 2013 at 4:06 p.m., the city had less than 8 weeks of cash on hand to pay bills as they came due. The city's credit rating was the lowest of any major city by far. It was at junk status and it was continuing to fall. The city could not generate bonding facility to do the projects that were needed. And there really wasn't much hope that the city was going to be able to grow its budget because, as we've said, people were leaving the city, the tax base was eroding. So there really wasn't much hope. And there weren't any assets. I was the mediator. My job was to get deals with the creditors. And so I needed cash, money, revenues, or assets that could be monetized into cash to pay creditors. And there really wasn't. It was really an assetless bankruptcy. So that's where we stood financially. But really, the life of the city is what I found heartbreaking. There's an antiseptic term that municipal bankruptcy experts use to describe a city in bankruptcy, and it's service delivery insolvent. So not only is the city financially insolvent, but it was service delivery insolvent. And by that, they meant no services were being provided to the people, which is, of course, one reason why people were leaving. Snow wasn't being plowed, trash wasn't being picked up. 42% of the city's 90,000 streetlights were out and they couldn't be repaired because the copper wire innards had been scavenged. The water and sewer system, the old DWSD, was springing leaks and collapsing with regularity. And because they were at the limit of their borrowing capacity under state law, there was no hope to raise more money to fix the infrastructure, very pressing infrastructure issues. I could go on and on. Those of you who lived in the area and remember Detroit 10 years ago will remember what it was like. It was a place, it was routinely the butt of jokes, late night jokes. Police response time, for example, to emergency calls was over an hour. The national average to emergency calls was 7 minutes. Yes, sir.
How many homes were abandoned?
You anticipated what I was going to say next. There were 150,000 blighted homes or vacant lots, many of them serving as homes to squatters, prostitutes, drug dealers, and of course many of them were burning, were catching fire. There were more than 12,000 fires a year. The fire department had no resources to respond. One of the things I remember from the bankruptcy was when one of the firemen was testifying. He talked, they couldn't afford a proper alarm system, so they rigged up a Coke can filled with pennies and put it on the fax machine. So that when the alarm came over the fax, it would knock over the Coke machine.
Oh, my God.
And that was actually on 60 Minutes. And
my-
that became kind of a representation of what life was like
Oh,
in the city. As I said, I could go on and on and on. It was really a pretty bleak situation. So that's where we were. You know, let me just
Sure.
say one more thing. There's a line in Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises. Everybody remember Ernest Hemingway? And one of the main characters was asked, how the hell did you ever end up in bankruptcy? And he said, 2 ways. Gradually, then suddenly. And that's really what happened in Detroit. This had been happening for decades. And Detroit was circling the drain, spiraling downward. And then all of a sudden, it couldn't pay its bills, couldn't borrow money. Population loss was continuing to spiral out of control. So it was really gradually, then suddenly.
So, how did it come to pass that you were asked to be the mediator in this, chief mediator, I should say, in this case? You were kind of reluctant.
I was, the personal reasons and professional reasons. So, I was the chief judge of the federal district court, which is in our little world of the federal judiciary, is a constitutional court. It's under Article 3 of the Constitution. The bankruptcy court is a statutory court, which is considered to be a lower level court. So it was a very unorthodox, unusual situation because as the chief judge, I would effectively be working for a lesser judge. Some of my colleagues didn't think that was a good idea. As one of my colleagues said to me, let me understand this, Jerry. You're the chief judge of one of the largest federal courts in the country, and you're going to be Steve Rhodes's lackey. Steve Rhodes was the bankruptcy judge. I didn't see it that way. I saw it as a way to hell. But there were a lot of institutional concerns about whether the chief judge of the district of the federal court should be effectively working for a bankruptcy judge. And some of my colleagues didn't think it was a good idea. And there were other better reasons. For example, appeals from the bankruptcy court came to our court. And so if I put together a deal and there were objections and there was an appeal and Steve Rhodes had approved the deal, the appeal would come to my colleagues. Obviously, I would be recused. But the deal would come to my colleagues, and as one of my colleagues pointed out to me, he said, you know, that's puts us in a rather awkward position, you know, to be in the position of having to pass judgment on a deal that their chief judge had put together. So there were those kinds of institutional issues as well. And beyond that, there were more arcane professional reasons. Conflict issues. I got good advice from the administrative office of the federal courts, the ethics officer. He consistently gave me good advice, and we were able to work through those. One of them was rather than having all of my colleagues get appeals, and then I couldn't talk to them, which wasn't very realistic. Hard to run a court when you can't talk to your colleagues. We decided to have whoever the first judge was who got the first appeal, that judge would get all of the appeals. And I would be walled off from talking to him, but at least not the rest of my colleagues. So we had to work through those issues, and we were able to work through those. So those were some of the professional issues. The personal issues were difficult too. I had a pretty full dance card. I was teaching part-time at the time, I think I was teaching at Wayne State University. I had a full judicial docket and my responsibilities as chief judge, and I was doing some lecturing and editing of books. And then there was my wife's view.
Oh,
When I first told her that I'd been asked to do this, this is a sanitized version. Those of you who are in a marriage, you know, her reaction was, you're always trying to cram 10 pounds of crap into a 1 pound bag. And she was very, very reluctant about it, but
Oh, yeah, that sounds plenty to do.
she didn't think it was a good idea at all. But you know, this all kind of crystallized on the weekend, right after Steve Rhodes, the judge, asked me, by the way, if you get the book, you can see Steve is on the cover with me and several of the other key players. Steve called me and I told him I hadn't made a decision, and he was pushing me to do it. And as he said, if I wasn't going to do it, he had to get somebody else to do it. And he wanted an answer. And we had a nice conversation on the phone. My 15-year-old son was sitting next to me in the car. You know, with Bluetooth, he could hear both sides of the conversation. He didn't say anything, but when we were driving home, he looked at me, and I'll pause here and just give a little bit of background. I'm a Winston Churchill aficionado. I've been a Churchill guy since I was in college. And Jake knows that. He heard all the speeches, he saw all the grainy old films of Winston Churchill from World War II. And so he knew that. And he knew a lot about Churchill's background as well. So he looked at me very intently and he said, "What do you think Churchill would have done, Dad? Do you think Churchill would have refused?" He said, "Everybody has a time to stand up. This is your time."
Wow. Wow.
It was like, boom, that's chapter 3. So when I got home, I told my wife what Jake had said. She just shook her head, said, "Okay."
So
Wow.
that'll change your mind.
Yeah.
That'll change your mind. Now, one thing I did was, I don't remember reading, but was there a picture of the doodle in the book?
There is a picture of the doodle in the book. So the doodle, I have to context this by sort of setting the stage. I've already talked about the situation, the financial situation, and the fact that there was an assetless bankruptcy. City did have one asset, the Detroit Institute of Arts. And all of the creditors wanted to, another sanitized word, monetize it, which means sell it, liquidate it. One creditor even, I was telling somebody beforehand, I think it was you, right? One creditor even hired an appraisal firm to figure out how to cut up the Diego Rivera murals and sell them off piece by piece.
Oh, God, no.
Yes, that's, one creditor was, one of the bond creditors had figured out a way, his appraiser had figured out a way to sell it off piece by piece. I think they thought they could get $500 to $700 million for the murals. And I thought this was a terrible idea. I thought that, you know, Detroit had been cannibalizing its heritage to mortgage its future for decades. And where had it gotten us? This would have just been one more Band-Aid without resolving the underlying issues. And even more than that, it would have been like dropping a bomb in the middle of Detroit. I went online and I saw that the DIA was attracting 600,000 people a year to Midtown. And if you'll remember, Midtown at the time was the one area that was kind of revitalizing slowly, but it would have been like dropping a hydrogen bomb in the middle of it. It would have sucked the life out of it. And I just felt that liquidating the DIA would have been the exclamation point on Detroit's obituary. You know, I felt if we did that, we would have been weighed by history in the balance and found wanting. So I was pretty focused on how to resolve these two big issues. Monetize, realize some money out of the DIA without liquidating it. And at the same time, not devastate the retirees. The emergency manager, Kevin Orr, was proposing 40% cuts to the retirees' pensions. And these were not plush pensions. The civilians, as we called them, folks who, worked as garbage men, folks who worked for the zoo, folks who worked for, any of the civilian jobs, clerks, their pensions were averaging $19,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
The uniforms, the police, the firefighters, and the EMT folks were averaging $32,000 a year, but they didn't get Social Security or Medicare. Yes,
EMS was part of General City at that time.
yes. Yeah. Actually, EMS, I think, was part of the uniforms. They were in the uniform.
Was what?
They were in the police firefighters pension system, the emergency medical units.
I'm a retired EMS.
Are you? You were in the civilian?
Yep,
Well,
that changed after the bankruptcy.
or during the bankruptcy, maybe it was. Trying to remember because there weren't a lot I knew. But it was important because of the way that the systems were managed. The uniform systems were managed far better than the civilian systems. In fact, 6 of the trustees in the, you may remember, 6 of the trustees in the civilians pension system were indicted and convicted, along with Kwame Kilpatrick and about 40 others. It was just coincidentally, as chief judge, I was also presiding over that grand jury that did the Detroit corruption cases. But at any rate, Kevin was, I'm sure you remember, Kevin was talking about cutting the pensions by 35 to 40%. And he was very serious about it. He really didn't have any choice. There was just not money to go around. And I'm sure you remember that the city had stopped making contributions to both systems, both the civilian system and the uniform system. So it was pretty dire. So I was very fixated on trying to figure out how to mitigate the pension losses for the retirees and how to realize value out of the DIA without liquidating it, without selling it. And I was talking to all of the lawyers, and they were very collegial conversations. I was down in Florida. This was right at the beginning with Jake. I had promised him a golf vacation. So, you don't break your promises to your 15-year-old son. So I was getting up early. I had taken down a lot of reading with me, getting up early and reading and talking to the lawyers. And at the end of every conversation with the creditors, they would ask, well, what about the art? What about the art? Is the city going to liquidate the museum? They would never say liquidate. They would really say monetize. And we had very robust discussions about how to monetize the art. So I got up one morning very early, about 5:30, made myself a pot of coffee, sat down, and in front of me was, I'd been taking notes on this legal pad of my conversations, and I ran out of paper on it, but the cardboard backing was in front of me. And I'm kind of a compulsive doodler. I do doodles all the time, and it just helps me think more concretely about abstract issues. So I sat down and I had this idea that maybe we could raise money from outside sources. Start with the state, try to raise money, get the state, Governor Snyder was the governor then, get the state to kickstart the funding and put the art in a trust, lock it off from all of the other creditors, and then use that trust and the money that we were able to raise to mitigate the retirees' pension losses. It's a crazy idea, but it was an idea. And so I doodled it out, and in one side, there is a picture of it in the book. One side, on my left side, I put a circle and I put state with an arrow with dollar signs, put the art in the middle. in a circle, and then I drew a square around the circle to indicate we were gonna lock it off from all the other creditors. And then I drew arrows from the trust to the pensions. I put another circle with pensions, indicating we would use the trust to flow money that we raised to the pensioners. That was the idea. And then I had some questions. How long was it gonna take? Because Detroit didn't have time. Detroit was circling the drain, and time was Detroit's enemy. The longer the bankruptcy took, the more population was gonna be lost. The more they were gonna continue to raise taxes. That's a death beetle. Raising taxes and raising fees to pay debts is a death beetle of the city. It's happening now in Chicago. Chicago's losing population. Chicago's pension funds, public pension funds, is $65 billion underfunded, and they're in complete denial. It's a denial is a river in Egypt. It's not a way to solve problems, and people are leaving the city in Chicago. Puerto Rico, of course, is in bankruptcy, and it goes on and on. Many cities are facing this. You know, Hollywood continues to make movies about tsunamis flooding over cities. The real tsunami is municipal debt. That's the real tsunami, and everybody ignores it, kicks it down the road, sweeps it under the rug. But you know, Detroit couldn't do that. So I was very fixated on this. So I did this doodle. It was just a doodle on the cardboard backing of a legal pad. And at the end of our golf trip, I put it in with the stack of reading that I had, got back to my chambers, took it out, put it in a pile behind my desk, and forgot about the doodle. I didn't forget about the idea, though. I was very fixated on the idea, but I forgot about the doodle totally. I rediscovered the doodle about 6 months later, and by this time we had all the deals done. And I looked at it and said, wow, this thing actually happened. And Gene Gargaro, who is also on the cover, was coming in for lunch that week. So I put it on my desk. I showed it to him. I said, you know what this is? He said he knew exactly what it was. He could see exactly what it was. He said, that's the grand bargain. I said, right. He said, that's got to hang in the DIA. And that's what it is. Hanging in the DIA.
Where is it?
That's an interesting story. This was very controversial during the bankruptcy. And some of the protesters were threatening to deface it. So they moved it up to the 3rd floor. I'm trying to get it back down, but free the doodle.
Where's
This is a public gallery.
It's not, it's in their private office space,
Oh,
so that people, which is very limited access.
okay.
Yeah, my buddy from Chicago came to the DIA, instead of looking at the painting, that's what he wanted to see.
Yeah,
It's like went up the 3rd floor, took pictures.
Salvador Solanport is the director of the DIA now. It's hanging in a public area, well, semi-public area right outside his office.
Why did protesters want to deface it when it was saving the
You
city
know,
and the
If you look at
museum?
the book, the tensions were so high. You can see the pictures of the protests outside our courtroom, outside our courthouse, rather. They were pretty raw. There's one picture here, you probably can't see it. Rick Snyder as the devil. And they were very angry, aggressive protests too. And those folks, every time I would go somewhere to speak there, I would have a welcoming committee
Oh,
of 100 people or so.
so they did not see it as a solution.
They saw it as their solution was the banks should get nothing, and the city should somehow raise money to pay all of their pensions.
Oh,
I understood it,
uh-huh,
but it wasn't very realistic.
uh-huh. Okay,
So, I mean, you described some of before of all these interests. You got the bondholders for the pensions, you got the workers, you got all these groups that want
170,000 creditors.
Oh, okay, that was one. That's a lot. I mean, how did you get them all to get together on one idea?
It took 16 and a half months, which sounds like a long time, but it's actually in the world of municipal bankruptcy, it's warp speed. Every municipality that was in bankruptcy when we started was still in bankruptcy when we finished. But Detroit didn't have that kind of time, you know, and if I felt very strongly that if Detroit got mired down in trench warfare litigation for years and years, there'd be nothing left of Detroit but dust and legal bills. I felt that very strongly. So we had to find a solution. And getting the grand bargain, we actually ended up raising for the pensions $830 million.
So did everybody get 100% of their pensions retroactive as well as going forward?
I wish there were a simple answer to that, but the uniforms got 100%,
Okay,
but they lost 50% of their cost of living increases. The
Oh.
civilians, because the pension funds were just not managed very well. And in some areas, in some cases corruptly, they took a 4.5% reduction, 4.5% reduction. And they lost all of their COLA, they lost all of their cost of living. And then they took a reduction in the amount of health care that the retirees were getting. There was about, as I said, there was about $6 billion, almost $6 billion in retiree healthcare debt. And so what we did was we transitioned the healthcare program. It was a very, very, very generous healthcare program. It was far better than I, as a federal judge, had. They had dental, vision. I don't begrudge it to them, but it was a very, very generous and very expensive healthcare program. So what we did was to transition the healthcare system into the Affordable Care Act. And we provided a stipend to buy different levels of care. I think the lowest level, least expensive level was $140, I think, where we landed per person, $140. And then you could buy all the way up to, you know, not quite the gold-plated coverage that they had, but that would have cost about, I think it was like $800 a month. Something.
ouch.
Yeah, well, healthcare is expensive, especially as you age. It's very expensive. So that's what we did. So the bondholders, on the other hand, took real haircuts. They took real haircuts. And for example, one group of bondholders got 12% on the dollar. And we gave them some property that they could develop and use. In fact, I don't know if you've seen the Water Square Tower and the hotel that's going up where Joe Louis used to be.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the very last deal we did in the bankruptcy, we gave away the ground underneath Joe Louis because it was about to be, you know, the Red Wings were about to move. So we gave away the property under Joe Louis. That deal we did at 2:30 at night. And I had our maintenance guy come and snap a picture of all of us. And I texted it to Judge Rhodes with one word, done, because it was the last deal and it meant Detroit was out of bankruptcy. Fully consensual plan of adjustment. But getting everybody there was hard. The first deal we did with a financial creditor, we did at my barber's. I took over some of the folks who I'd been negotiating with for months. I had to get a haircut, and I called Frankie. He was my 78-year-old Italian barber, and I said, I'm going to be bringing some folks over. A couple of them might need a haircut. And I got the governor on my phone, and we negotiated it was for the UTGOs, the unlimited tax general obligation bonds. And we did a very good deal. We cut their payments by 36%. And with the money that we saved, we created a fund for the retirees that we added to the money we raised to enhance the, well, to further mitigate the losses in the pensions. And you know, so they took a pretty good hit. That became known as the haircut at the haircut, which is a chapter in the book.
It's a good story.
And you know, everybody got on board. I started telling people once we started getting deals and agreements, I started telling the creditors who were recalcitrant that a bankruptcy is like a train waiting at a station. That people who buy the first tickets get the best deals, people who buy the second tickets get the next best deals, and so forth. And then I will look at them and say, and people who don't buy tickets end up in front of the train. And that's where you're gonna end up.
Oh,
You're gonna get zero. I wasn't very popular with some of them, but that's okay. I had a lifetime appointment.
Oh, briefly, it was wonderful how all the foundations gave so much money.
So they were the first ones in. Thanks for the question. I sometimes get sidetracked. It's a very large, sprawling, complicated story. So when I first went to Rick Snyder, the governor, he was an old friend of mine. He had actually worked for me in 1982 when I ran for Congress. Dearborn was actually in my district.
Wow.
And I lost, fortunately, but Rick was working for me. And if I could have picked one person who would be the least likely person in the campaign to ever run for politics himself, it would have been Rick. He was super smart. He went through University of Michigan and got 3 degrees, an accounting degree, a business degree, and a law degree in 5 years.
wow.
But he was very awkward around people. We would go to Rotary Club gatherings and Lions Club and and Rick would stand in the back of the room and he'd look down at his shoes. And then when we were driving back to the office, he would ask very penetrating questions, but never about politics. It was always about policy issues. And you might remember when he ran for governor, he called his slogan was "One tough nerd."
Yes.
I knew he was a nerd. I didn't know how tough he'd be. He turned out to be very tough. And there's wonderful stories about Rick in here. He said he was an amazing negotiating partner. I negotiated with him all the time. And just as one example of Rick's leadership and his vision, we got the retirees to agree to the grand bargain. By the way, I didn't come up with the name grand bargain. A free press writer came up with it. But we got the retirees to agree, so that was the first part. No, the first part was the foundations. We got the foundations, we got the retirees, but we were still short. And I started negotiating with Gene Gargaro, chairman of the DIA, and he got to about $50 million, and he said even that was going to be a stretch. So I called Rick and I said, you know, Gene is recommending $50 million to his board, but he's not even sure he can get to that. And Rick said, you know, I'm getting an award from a group called the Americans for Art at the end of the month, and I'm going to invite Gene to go with me and I'll talk to him. So the night before he was going to Washington, D.C. to get the award, he calls me at about 10 o'clock at night. My wife and I are watching TV and I'm doing some reading, and Rick calls me and he says, guess what I've been doing for the last 2 hours? This is the governor of the state of Michigan. Remember, he was an accountant. I don't know, Rick, what have you been doing? He said, I've got the DIA's audited financials. I can figure out a way to save them $5 to $7 million a year. And then he dove into this accountant speak stuff, which, you know, went over my head. We call it dolphin speak. And I said, great, Rick. I said, what are you going to do with that? He said, I'm going to ask Gene Gargaro for $100 million tomorrow. I said, Rick, get the award first. And sure enough, the next day he called me and he was ebullient, and he said, I had a very productive breakfast with Gene Gargaro. I said, great, how productive? He said, I got you $100 million. I said, really? He said, yep. You know, my first instinct was to call Gene, because even smart people like the governor hear what they want to hear and disregard the rest. That's a line from Paul Simon's song, The Boxer. And so I just decided to wait to hear from Gene, to hear it directly. I wanted to hear it fresh from him. So Gene called me that afternoon, and he still sounded a little overwhelmed and befuddled. And I said, how was your breakfast, Governor, this morning? He said, that was the most expensive breakfast in history. So that's the title of the chapter too. By the way, a friend of mine told me that if there was a Pulitzer Prize for chapter titles, this book would win. I said, what about the book? He said, about the book. He said, but the chapter titles are great. And so that was how we got $100 million from the DIA. And you know what? They raised it in 9 months. 9 months. And the story of how the governor came on board, which was actually came on board first, he had been telling me no in very nice ways. You know, his mantra was relentless positive action. Very positive guy. But he was still telling me no. And finally, one of his staff guys, Dennis Muchmore, his chief of staff, called me and said, with all due respect, Judge, what part of no don't you understand? Because I kept asking. So, you know, I ran into Miriam Nolan. She's the gal in the center here. Some of you may remember Miriam. She was the founder and president of the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. Wonderful person, very resourceful. I ran into her at the deli across the street from the courthouse. And she asked me how things were going. I said, not great, but I've got an idea. Can you come over and talk about it? So she came over and I spun out this idea of leveraging the art to raise money. And I said, but I'm not getting very far with the governor. And I need somebody to kickstart the funding. And I said, how about the foundations? And she looked at me like I was crazy. And she said, how much do you know about foundations? I said, not very much. And she said, well, the first thing you have to know is that foundations don't work together. We all have our own mission silos. Even with Katrina and 9/11, we didn't work together. So that's the first thing. And she said, the next thing is the grant making process is very slow. Even small grants of 50 million can take 25 million, 50 million can take years. And she says, it sounds like you don't have a lot of time and you need a lot of money. So this is going to take a long time. But I said, Miriam, if you could just bring your colleagues from all over the country. And she was very well known around the country in the philanthropy world and very well respected. So in a couple days, she got me the email addresses of the foundation leaders. I wrote them an email. This is amazing. I wrote them all an email inviting them to Detroit. I told them I had a mediation team. Told them I'd have my team there and we'd give them the inside story of what was happening in the bankruptcy. And 14 minutes later, Darren Walker, who's right here, he'd been president of the Ford Foundation for about a month. He was brand new. He said he would be there on November 5th. And everybody else that followed. And our meeting with the foundations was on November 5th. We had a lot of work in between. And they all came. Meeting started at 4 o'clock in our conference center in the court. I told them it had to be confidential. There was a court order on mediation, a confidentiality order, so they had to keep it confidential. Of course, there were 2 reporters waiting outside, one at each exit of our courthouse. So secret didn't last, but the story of what happened in the meeting lasted 8 days. And then there was a front page story on the Detroit News about the meeting with the foundation folks. And this is an incredible story. About a month after the meeting, I had just finished a sentence in court. It was a horrible sentence. It was very emotional. Everybody in the courtroom was crying. I come in and my admin said, Darren Walker's on the phone for you. I get on the phone and Darren says, Judge, my board is inspired by your idea and we want to make the largest commitment in the history of the Ford Foundation. I had no idea how much that was. And I didn't want to be crass and ask, but he said, we're going to commit $125 million. I was stunned.
Wow.
And I said the first thing that came to my mind, which was, when the history of this bankruptcy is written, Darren, you will be the hero. And he is one of the heroes. And he said, no. He said, you're going to be hearing from all of my colleagues. We're all making similar commitments, the largest commitments in our history. You'll be hearing from them over the next few days. And within 3 days, I had $191 million, $291 million in commitments. So I thought, time to go back and see the governor, because all of these commitments were conditional upon the state being a substantial contributor, being a stakeholder, as they put it, which was understandable. So I knew that was going to be a tall order given my conversations with Rick in the past. So I went up to meet with Rick. I called his schedule and said I need to get on his schedule. And I got the call from Darren Walker on a Monday, met with the governor and his staff on Friday morning. We were all sitting in kind of a semicircle, and the governor was sitting right next to me. And I had planned out kind of what I was going to say. I took one of my co-mediators with me, Eugene Dreiker, who was a real hero too. And any of you know Eugene Dreiker? He was a real great lawyer and a community leader. Looks sort of like Yoda. Wispy gray hair, gray eyebrows. So I took Eugene with me. And we had planned out what we were going to say to the governor. And he asked me how things were going. And I said, we're not getting any deals, Rick. It's an assetless bankruptcy. And to get deals, I need money or assets that can be monetized. I said, but there's some good news that I want to share with you. And the good news is that foundations, this had all been in the news, the foundation, but the numbers had not been in the news. The foundations are starting to make commitments. And I said, Rick, you made a very courageous decision to put the city into bankruptcy. It was the right decision. It was a decision all of your predecessors had kicked down the road and swept under the rug. But you can't throw up your hands now and say, not my problem. I said, we're starting to get these commitments, but I have to tell you, and I had an email from Rip Rapson of the Kresge Foundation, putting out all the conditions, and I got it out and I read it to him. And I said, this is an assetless bankruptcy, Rick. We can't leave this money on the sidelines. You and I both know that invariably all of these commitments, all of these numbers will become public. And in this assetless bankruptcy, we can't leave the money just on the sidelines. I said, if we do, we will all be weighed by history in the balance and found wanting. I remember he understood it. He got it right away. And he said, what are you looking for? I said, I think you're going to have to at least match the foundations, at least. And he said, how much do you think you're going to get to? He had added up. I went over each of the commitments. I opened up my I wanted to be a little dramatic to get his attention. And he had asked me, what the commitments were, and I opened up my portfolio. I was keeping a tally sheet, which is in the book. And I started, of course, with the showstopper, the Ford Foundation. I said, Ford Foundation's committed $125 million. You may remember Rick had kind of a high-pitched voice. He said, really? Just so like I said, yes. And I said, and Kresge has committed 100 million. He said, really? And then I went through the numbers. I was going to trot out with a little bit of drama. I was going to trot out the total. But Ed was adding it up in his head. He said, so you got 291 million in commitments. I said, right. And that's when I said, we can't leave the money on the sideline. And he asked me, he's a very smart guy. He said, you know, this is going to be very hard getting this from the legislature. Of course, everybody was saying no bailout for Detroit. Not only the state legislators were saying that, but the Obama administration was saying that. In fact, I talked to one of President Obama's chief aides, Valerie Jarrett, twice. And she said, nothing. She said, we can't do it. You know, every other municipality will be lining up. So he said, the governor said, you know, you can't, if we're only going to get one shot at this, you can't come back to me and retrade me. And I said, I understand that. And then he said, the ultimate question, he asked me the ultimate question. He said, do you think it'll be enough? By that, he meant, will it make a difference? Will it get Detroit out of bankruptcy? And I looked at Eugene, and Eugene was sitting there. I can still see him with his eyebrows scrunched up and just nodding me to say yes. Because this was a hinge of fate moment. He said, so what's your ask? I said, I think we're going to get to $350 million with the pensions, maybe more. He said, okay. He said, you think it's going to be enough? I said, we're going to need more. We may need another 100 million. And we'll go to the private sector. We'll go to the DIA. But if we get 350 from the state and 350 from the foundations and another 100 million, we'll make it work, Rick. He reached over, we shook hands, and he said, this will be a partnership, Jerry. That was it. When we were walking out, Dick Posthumous, some of you may remember Dick.
Yeah.
Dick was lieutenant governor, but he was also then became Governor Snyder's legislative liaison person. And as I'm watching, as this conversation with the governor is unfolding, and he's kind of moving our way, I'm looking at Dick. I thought Dick was going to have a heart attack because he was the one that was going to have to sell this to the legislature. And remember back then, this was a conservative Republican controlled legislature, the Tea Party.
Oh,
And I knew it was going to be very, very difficult. So as we were walking out of the governor's office, Dick comes over and he puts his arm around me and he says, Jerry, we've known each other a long time, but you have no idea how hard this is going to be. Then he pointed at the governor. He said, and neither does he.
oh.
But we did it.
How
Over.
long did it take from that meeting for them to come through?
Pardon?
How long did it take from that meeting for them to come through?
Amazingly quickly. That meeting was, I can tell you exactly the date. It was the 13th of December. And then I met with all the legislators. I told Dick Posthumous, I said, I don't have a plan B. There's not another option. And I said, if necessary, I'll meet with all the legislators,
Wow.
which I ended up doing. That was December 13th, and the grand bargain legislation passed in May, I believe it was.
Wow.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And it was, to me, one of the most emotional moments of the bankruptcy was, in many emotional moments, when people stepped up and became heroes. Tom Casperson, who was a state senator from the Upper Peninsula, very conservative business guy, but very well respected. When he stood up to talk in the state senate, everybody, you could hear a pin drop. And Tom said, today we are all Detroiters.
Wow. Oh, wow.
We have,
I choked up, I really did.
Yeah.
you know, we have time for just a couple more questions. What are the key lessons, youth, in your view, of the Grand Bargain?
So, you know, when I was going through the bankruptcy, it was sort of head down, blinders on, get this deal, get the next deal, get the next deal, get the next deal. But with 10 years removed and a different perspective now, I think about it as a story about people coming together to solve a big, big problem. And, you know, in our society, we just don't see that now. Politicians seem so invested in dividing people. And I understand it, that's where the money is, you know? The left has its interest groups that fund them, the right has their interest groups that fund them. And that's where the profit is for politicians, to divide people. I could go into a whole lecture. I worked in the US Senate for 5.5 years back in the late 70s. And it was very different.
Yeah.
But now politicians in both parties just seem to divide people. And so one of the things I think about this book is it's a story of people coming together to rescue a great city. And look where Detroit is now. You know, last year I sat down to write the epilogue because I hadn't written an epilogue. I actually wrote the book right after the bankruptcy 10 years ago, but I hadn't written an epilogue. So I think I thought the book needed an epilogue. So I thought I could do it. I'm a fast writer, so I thought I could write it in 2 or 3 days. It took me almost a month to write the epilogue because there was so much that had happened, so much going on in Detroit. You know, everywhere from the population starting to grow again and the credit rating. In fact, I sent the epilogue over to Mayor Duggan to read to make sure I didn't miss anything. He read it, he said, come on over, we'll talk about it. While I was in his office, his chief of staff, Stephanie Washington, comes in and she said, Moody's just called, Mayor. We've got another credit rating increase, 10th credit rating increase, 10 years, unheard of. And Detroit's credit rating is now amongst the very highest of all the major cities.
Wow.
And of course, we saved the DIA, which for the last 2 years was voted the #1 art museum in the country. And the retirees, you
Yeah,
know,
yes.
He had a debtor, Fitch. What were they promised? Were they promised in Joe Louis Arena?
Fidget,
Fidget.
yeah, Financial Guarantee Corporation, yeah. We gave them the property under Joe Louis. There's a great story about that too. It was the last deal, that was the last deal we did in the bankruptcy, 2:30 in the morning. We gave them the land under Joe Louis. That was a tough negotiating session. Gave them the land under Joe Louis and also the land under the parking structure, the Joe Louis parking structure. And I had our maintenance guy come in and he snapped a picture on my BlackBerry of 14 exhausted people, pictures in here. And on the way home, I texted it to Steve Rhodes with one word, done. And he printed it out, held it up in court the next morning or that morning. And it went viral all over. I never got a photo credit for that. Or the maintenance guy, I guess, he took the picture. But the picture's in the book. Yes.
Can you explain for my petite financial brain how the trust made money? Because I know you said you got the money from the state, then you put the little box to get the DIA protected in that little box, and
So we
then
put all the money that we raised from the state,
okay,
from the foundations, and from the DIA. We put it all in the trust
okay,
and paid it out over 20 years. And what we really did was I didn't come up with this idea. This was brilliant. We bought the city a 10-year holiday from making pension contributions. City has not made a pension contribution in 10 years.
Okay,
And we use that money, that's what I used to get all the loans, and to reinvest. And to reinvest, all the streetlights are on,
yeah. Oh,
all the
so,
streetlights are on in Detroit. And not only are the streetlights on, but there's no copper wiring, they're state-of-the-art lighting.
okay, so,
And the blight is being cleaned up. And it's really quite remarkable what's happened in Detroit. I don't know if
Yes.
folks get to Detroit, but I work downtown
oh, yeah.
and it's very vibrant.
Oh.
You know, Campus Martius was chosen last year
Uh-huh,
as the #1 public space in the
yes,
country.
yes, yeah.
#1 public space. There's in the summer, there's beach volleyball. In the winter, there's a skating rink,
Uh-huh, and the river walk.
the river walk.
It's,
It's really quite wonderful. It's fun to be downtown again, and
Yeah.
of course, all the restaurants,
uh-huh,
and the kids are coming back, you know.
Train station.
yeah,
Pardon?
the train
The
station.
train station's on the cover.
Ah!
Here's the old train station, there's the new train station. Corktown is exploding.
Yes, yes,
It's, you know, when I go around the country now, people ask me, "Dad, what's happening in Detroit?" And keep reading. It was chosen as the #1, 2 years ago, #1 destination by the New York Times travel section. #1 travel destination.
It's beautiful.
It is. And they,
The only problem is the park.
yes,
One
don't get me started on the parking.
They had 180 food trucks, but you're gonna have to pay $25 to park, walk 5 miles.
I know. But you know, that's actually a good sign,
Well, yeah,
because it means people are downtown.
yeah,
it's wonderful.
yeah.
Sir,
Yeah, so how's Chicago giving away, we're not being bankrupt?
they have very simple. They have a governor who's not willing to take the political hits. He wants to run for president, and he doesn't have the political courage that Rick Snyder. I know this sounds unkind, but he doesn't have the political courage to take on the unions, to take on the bondholders, to take on all the vested interests. Rick Snyder, to do what he did, took amazing courage, and there was nothing in it for him. Remember, he was running for re-election in 2014, and for a Republican from outstate to take this on, he certainly wasn't going to get any thanks from the Democratic base in Detroit, who were very angry at him for appointing an emergency manager. And he wasn't getting any credit from the outstate Republican base. It was just courageous of him. One tough nerd, though.
Yeah, any questions?
Actually, there's one person online, they have a kind of a couple questions. One of them was about how much fraud and theft was discovered. And there's a second part of the question, the same person, he was talking about Rick Snyder, that there were major issues with him on a few issues in Michigan, the biggest, which is the Flint water crisis and stuff like that.
I have a lot to say about that. I know a lot about it, and I'll just say this, it's all baloney. I was very involved in it because Genesee County and Flint wanted to leave the DWSD. We also transitioned the DWSD to the Great Lakes Water Authority, which is now a regional authority. And Flint wanted to leave the DWSD. Governor tried to persuade them not to, said they weren't ready. They didn't have an alternative water system. And it was the city council that agreed to do it. And then the managers of that water system decided not to put the phosphorus in the water, which is what was responsible for the lead poisoning.
So you're saying it was the city council of Flint
They voted
Okay.
6-1
to,
to take Flint out of the DWSD and to go to the Flint River for the water source.
Instead of getting it from.
It wasn't the council, it wasn't the council that decided not to phosphorus, and I don't know who decided that. Phosphorus is what dissolved. the
why
water.
did they make that decision?
They were frustrated with it. Everybody was frustrated. It wasn't just Flint. Everybody was frustrated with DWSD. Everybody.
Uh-huh,
People thought that the DWSD was raping the suburbs to prop up the people in Detroit who weren't paying their water bills. And there was a certain amount of truth to that.
So we've got time for one more question.
I remember reading in the paper about the decision not to add the phosphorus in remember the figure of what it would have cost was somewhere around $147 or $155 per day. Do you remember what the exact number was that?
I don't remember, but the total number was, it was almost nothing.
Yeah.
You know, it was, you know, a couple $100,000, few $100,000 to do it. I don't know why they decided not to, but it wasn't Rick Snyder who made that decision, that's for sure.
The cost would have been for adding the phosphorus?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
I can't remember exactly what
That's
it was.
$100 a day.
The prosecution of Rick Snyder is one of the darkest moments in Michigan's history. It's totally politically motivated and really unsavory. So,
Well, we got to finish up here.
did I answer? There was two
Oh, yeah.
questions.
Did you?
What was the second question from the online?
Well, that was the second part of it about
Oh, the
the
corruption.
first part was the fraud and corruption.
The fraud and corruption, as I said, I presided over the grand jury at the time, and there's 23 people on a grand jury. Those folks are heroes. They served for 3.5 years as grand jurors. And usually I would get letters asking to be excused for one reason or another. In that 3.5 year period, I didn't get a single letter. And when I discharged them, I went down to talk to them, and I thought I was gonna get, you know, blasted for keeping them so long. And it was totally the opposite. They all told me what an incredible, important experience it was for them. And they told me this, which I didn't know, it was never made public. And I was presiding over the grand jury. When the grand jury returns an indictment, usually it's just the foreperson that goes in, or the deputy foreperson. And they read the indictment. If it's a very long indictment, the two of them go in together and they split up the reading. Every one of the 23 of them went in to return the indictment because they wanted to show solidarity behind the decision. They were heroic. I heard story after story of sick illnesses in the families, all sorts of things.
So,
Anything else?
yeah,
One. All right, one more.
How much is your book?
How much is my book? $29.95. And you can pay by credit card, and I'll sign it.
okay.
Thanks for coming, folks.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much.